The Arizona sun beat mercilessly against Margaret Steele's weathered farmhouse as she watched the stranger on horseback approach, his silhouette shimmering in the heat like a mirage promising either salvation or ruin. And in the summer of 1877, she had already seen enough of the latter. Margaret wiped her brow with a handkerchief, tucking a strand of honey-brown hair behind her ear. At 32, she had been widowed for just over a year when influenza took her husband James. Left alone with 3 children and a struggling cattle ranch, she fought daily battles against nature, debt, and the whispers in Copper Creek that a woman couldn't manage such an enterprise. The rider drew closer, and Margaret recognized the straight-backed posture of Mason Adams, the new ranch foreman at the neighboring Diamond Cross. She had only exchanged brief pleasantries with him since his arrival in town 3 months prior. The townsfolk said he'd ridden with cattlemen in Texas and had a reputation for getting results. His methods, however, remained the subject of speculation. Mason dismounted his chestnut stallion with practiced ease, removing his hat to reveal dark hair peppered with silver at the temples. Though not yet 40, his face carried the weathered lines of a man who had spent his life beneath harsh skies. "Mrs. Steele," he greeted, his voice deep but not unkind. "Mr. Adams," Margaret replied, squinting against the sun. "What brings you to Broken Wheel Ranch?" Before he could answer, a crash from inside the house was followed by shouting. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, sighing. "The children again," she explained. "Please excuse me." She led Mason to the porch as the front door burst open. Her eldest, 10-year-old Thomas, emerged backward, struggling with his 8-year-old sister Laura. 6-year-old Sarah trailed behind them, tears streaming down her face. "He broke my doll," Sarah wailed. "I didn't. Laura pushed me into the table," Thomas protested. Laura twisted free of her brother's grasp. "Did not. You were running inside like Pa always said not to." At the mention of their father, a momentary silence fell over the children. Margaret felt the familiar ache in her chest, the one that never truly went away. "Children," she said firmly. "We have a guest. This is Mr. Adams from Diamond Cross." The children quieted, studying the tall stranger with curious eyes. Mason nodded toward them, then looked at Margaret. "Spirited bunch you have there, Mrs. Steele." "They're grieving," she replied quietly. "We all are still." His expression softened slightly. "Of course. I didn't mean to intrude on family matters. I came about your cattle." Margaret tensed. "What about them?" 3 head of your stock wandered onto Diamond Cross land. "I've returned them to your north pasture," he explained. "But your fence line needs repair. It won't hold through another storm." "I'm aware," Margaret said, her voice tighter than she intended. "I haven't had time to ride out and assess the damage." Mason glanced at the children, who had resumed their bickering in hushed tones. "They need discipline," he said plainly. "Structure. It's what children crave after loss." Margaret straightened, bristling at the presumption. "Try kindness first, Mr. Adams. Discipline without understanding only breaks spirits. I won't have that for my children." Something flickered in Mason's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or memory. He replaced his hat and nodded. "Fair enough. But the same might be said for cattle. Without proper boundaries, they'll scatter to the 4 winds. Are you comparing my children to livestock, Mr. Adams?" The corner of his mouth turned up slightly. "Only suggesting that both benefit from consistent care. I'll be back tomorrow to help with that fence line. Good day, Mrs. Steele." Before Margaret could protest, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving her standing on the porch with her quarreling children, and the unsettling feeling that her carefully constructed independence had just been challenged. The following morning, Margaret rose before dawn. She'd spent a restless night thinking about Mason Adams and his offer, or was it a declaration? to help with the fence. She didn't need charity, especially not from a man who presumed to know what her children needed after speaking to them for all of 2 minutes. She dressed quickly in a simple work dress and boots, pinning her hair up and securing it with a faded blue bandana. After checking on the sleeping children, she slipped out to the barn where she saddled her mare, Penny. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when she reached the north pasture. To her surprise, a figure on horseback was already inspecting the damaged fence line. Mason Adams dismounted when he saw her approach, his expression unreadable in the pre-dawn light. "You're up early," he remarked. "As are you," Margaret countered, sliding from Penny's back. "I didn't expect you before breakfast." "Fence won't fix itself," Mason replied, already unloading tools from his saddlebags. "And your cattle won't wait for a convenient hour to wander." Margaret bristled again at his tone but couldn't argue with his logic. She approached the fence, assessing the damage. Several posts had rotted at the base, causing the wire to sag. "I brought replacement posts," Mason said, pointing to a small pile of timber she hadn't noticed in the dim light. "Should be enough for today's work." "Mr. Adams," Margaret began, "I appreciate the gesture, but I can't accept—" "It's not charity, Mrs. Steele," he interrupted, seeming to read her thoughts. "It's neighborly. My employer has an interest in clear property lines." Margaret studied him, trying to determine if there was more to his offer than he was stating. "And what does Mr. Blackwell get from this arrangement? Peace of mind. And so do you." Mason handed her a pair of work gloves. "Shall we begin?" For the next several hours, they worked in companionable silence, digging out rotted posts and setting new ones. Margaret was no stranger to ranch work, having helped her husband before his passing and taken on everything since. Still, she found herself impressed by Mason's efficiency and the lack of condescension in his manner. He worked alongside her as an equal, neither slowing for her benefit nor taking over tasks she was capable of handling. As the sun climbed higher, Margaret removed her bandana to wipe sweat from her brow. "You're good at this," she admitted. Mason looked up from tamping soil around a newly set post. "Been doing it since I was a boy. My father had a small ranch in Texas." "Is that where you learned about discipline?" she asked, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. He paused, considering her question. "My father believed in firm boundaries. He wasn't cruel, but he was exacting." "And did that serve you well?" Mason drove the tamping tool into the ground with more force than necessary. "It kept me alive. The world isn't kind to those who don't know their place in it." "Perhaps," Margaret said softly, "but knowing one's place doesn't mean accepting it without question." Their eyes met across the fence line, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared stubbornness, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. "Your children," Mason said after a moment. "They miss their father." It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. "Every day. Thomas tries to be the man of the house. Laura challenges everything, and Sarah—" She swallowed. "Sarah still cries for him at night." Mason nodded, his expression softening. "My mother died when I was 9. Father never remarried. Some days I thought his discipline was all that held our family together. And other days I just wanted him to say it was all right to be sad." The admission hung in the air between them, surprisingly vulnerable from a man who carried himself with such certainty. Margaret found herself reappraising Mason Adams, wondering what other complexities lay beneath his weathered exterior. The moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. They both turned to see Thomas approaching on his pony, riding with an urgency that immediately put Margaret on alert. "Mama," he called as he drew closer. "It's Sarah. She fell from the apple tree and won't stop crying." Margaret was already mounting Penny before Thomas finished speaking. She looked at Mason, who nodded in understanding. "Go," he said. "I'll finish here." She hesitated only briefly before spurring Penny toward home, Thomas following close behind. As she rode, Margaret was struck by the realization that she trusted Mason to complete the work, a trust she hadn't extended to anyone since James died. Sarah's injury proved less serious than feared, a sprained wrist and wounded pride rather than broken bones. Dr. Miller from town wrapped it carefully and prescribed rest, which the active 6-year-old protested vehemently. But I was climbing to see if the robin's eggs had hatched. Sarah explained through tears, her small face pinched with indignation. Margaret smoothed her daughter's auburn curls. "The robin will understand if you wait until your wrist heals." "How long will that be?" Sarah asked, lower lip trembling. "A couple of weeks, doctor." Miller answered, packing his bag. "Which means no tree climbing, young lady." The doctor's stern tone caused Sarah to shrink against Margaret, who instinctively tightened her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "We'll find other ways to check on the birds," she promised, after Dr. Miller left. Margaret settled Sarah on the sofa with a picture book before stepping onto the porch where Laura and Thomas waited anxiously. "Is Sarah going to die?" Laura asked, her voice small despite the dramatic question. "Of course not," Margaret assured her. "It's just a sprain. But she'll need extra help for a while." Thomas squared his shoulders. "I can do her chores." "Me too," Laura added, not to be outdone. Margaret smiled at their eagerness. "Thank you both. And perhaps you could take turns reading to her. Sarah gets restless when she can't move about." The children nodded solemnly, accepting their missions with surprising grace. As they went inside to see their sister, Margaret remained on the porch, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. She leaned against a post, closing her eyes against unexpected tears. "Mrs. Steele." The voice startled her. She turned to find Mason Adams approaching, his horse tethered to the hitching post. In one hand he carried a small wooden object. "Mr. Adams." "I'm sorry for leaving so abruptly," Margaret said, quickly composing herself. "No apologies needed. How is your daughter?" "Sprained wrist. Nothing serious, though she's disappointed about being confined to the ground." Mason nodded, then extended the item in his hand, a small, roughly carved bird. "Thought she might like this. Not much of a substitute for real birds, but—" He trailed off, suddenly awkward. Margaret took the carving, touched by the unexpected gesture. "You made this." "When?" "Finished the fence and had some time before sundown. Old habit my father taught me to keep my hands busy." She turned the small wooden robin over in her palm, noting the careful detail in the wings and beak. "It's beautiful. Sarah will treasure it." Mason shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "The fence line is secure. Should hold through summer at least." "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you. No need." He glanced toward the house. "Your children, they're good kids." "Spirited, like you said, but good-hearted." Margaret smiled softly. "They are. Even on days when they test my patience to its limits." "Your approach seems to be working well enough," Mason admitted, and Margaret recognized how difficult the concession was for him. "Though a little structure wouldn't hurt." "Perhaps we're both right," she offered. "Kindness and boundaries aren't mutually exclusive." Their conversation was interrupted by the front door opening as Thomas peered out. "Mama, Sarah's asking for you." He noticed Mason and straightened, trying to appear older than his 10 years. "Good evening, Mr. Adams." "Evening, son," Mason replied, tipping his hat. "You taking good care of your mama and sisters?" Thomas nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir, doing my best." "That's all anyone can ask," Mason said, his tone gentler than Margaret had heard before. He turned back to her. "I should be going. Good evening, Mrs. Steele." As he mounted his horse, Margaret called after him, "Mr. Adams, would you care to join us for Sunday dinner, as thanks for your help?" Mason appeared surprised by the invitation, his usual composed demeanor momentarily faltering. "That's kind of you, but not necessary." "Nevertheless," Margaret persisted, "the offer stands. 1 o'clock if you're amenable." After a moment's consideration, he nodded. 1 o'clock then. "Good night, Mrs. Steele." As Mason rode away, Thomas looked up at his mother curiously. "Is Mr. Adams coming to dinner?" "Yes," Margaret answered, surprised by her own pleased anticipation. "Yes, he is." Sunday arrived with clear skies, and a persistent flutter in Margaret's stomach that she attributed to the challenge of preparing a proper meal. She had risen early to put a chicken in the oven and set bread dough to rise, all while telling herself that this was merely a neighborly gesture, not cause for the extra care she took with her appearance. The children, however, seemed to sense something significant in their mother's preparations. Laura insisted on wearing her best dress, while Thomas meticulously polished his boots. Even Sarah, despite her bandaged wrist, wanted her hair arranged in special ringlets. "Why are you all so determined to impress Mr. Adams?" Margaret asked as she helped Sarah with her ribbons. "He's the first person you've invited for dinner since Pa died," Laura observed with the disarming directness of an 8-year-old. "And you're wearing your blue dress, the one Pa always said matched your eyes." Margaret paused, caught off guard by her daughter's perception. "It's simply good manners to look presentable for guests." Laura exchanged a knowing look with Sarah that made Margaret wonder when her daughters had grown so intuitive. Before she could question them further, Thomas called from the front room, "Ryder coming. It's Mr. Adams." Mason arrived precisely at 1 o'clock, his usual work clothes replaced by a clean shirt and vest. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, efforts at refinement that both pleased and unsettled Margaret. In one hand, he carried a small bundle wrapped in paper. "Mrs. Steele," he greeted, removing his hat. "Thank you for the invitation." "Mr. Adams, welcome to our home properly this time," she added with a smile. He nodded to the children, who had arranged themselves by height beside their mother. "Miss Laura, Miss Sarah, young Thomas. You all look mighty fine today." Sarah stepped forward boldly, holding up her bandaged wrist. "Look, Mr. Adams, Dr. Miller says I'm healing nicely." "Glad to hear it," Mason replied. "I brought something that might help pass the time while you're mending." He extended the package to Sarah, who accepted it eagerly. Inside was a set of carved wooden animals, a horse, cow, rabbit, and bird similar to the robin he'd made previously. Sarah gasped in delight, carefully arranging them on her palm. "Did you make these yourself?" she asked, eyes wide. "I did. Thought they might keep you company when you can't chase after real ones." Thomas examined the carvings with obvious admiration. "These are fine work, sir. Pa tried to teach me whittling, but I never got the hang of it." Something flickered in Mason's eyes, sympathy, perhaps, or understanding. "Takes practice. I could show you sometime if your mother approves." 3 hopeful faces turned to Margaret, who found herself smiling at Mason's unexpected gesture. "That's very kind. Perhaps after dinner you could give Thomas his first lesson." The meal passed more pleasantly than Margaret had anticipated. Mason, though still reserved, proved to be a considerate guest who drew out the children with questions about their interests and responsibilities on the ranch. Thomas especially flourished under the attention, eagerly describing the calf he was raising and his plans for improving the chicken coop. "Sounds like you have a good head for planning," Mason observed. "Important skill for a rancher." Thomas straightened, pride evident in his posture. "I want to make the ranch successful again. For Mama." "We're doing fine, Thomas," Margaret said automatically, though the financial realities were considerably more complex than she let on. Mason glanced at her, a question in his eyes that suggested he understood more than she had revealed. Running a ranch is never easy, he said carefully, especially these days with the railroads changing everything. Pa said the railroad would be good for ranchers, Laura interjected. But then the prices for cattle went down instead of up. Margaret was startled by her daughter's grasp of their situation. James had indeed placed great hope in the railroad's arrival in Arizona territory, but the expected prosperity had proven elusive for smaller operations like theirs. Your father was right about the opportunity, Mason explained gently. But big cattle companies from back east saw the same opportunity and brought in more cattle than the market could handle. That doesn't seem fair, Sarah said with a child's simple sense of justice. No, it's not, Mason agreed. But there are still ways for smaller ranches to succeed. After dinner, while Margaret and the girls cleared the table, Mason kept his promise to Thomas. They sat on the porch, where Mason demonstrated basic whittling techniques with patience Margaret hadn't expected from him. Through the open window, she could hear their conversation, Mason explaining how to find the grain of the wood, Thomas asking thoughtful questions. There was something about the scene that made Margaret's heart constrict with both gratitude and sadness. Gratitude for Mason's kindness to her son, and sadness for all the moments James would never share with his children. Later, as the afternoon lengthened into evening and the children entertained themselves in the yard, Margaret and Mason sat on the porch swing, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western hills. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly, "for today, for Thomas especially." Mason nodded, his profile softened by the golden light. "He's a good boy, carries a heavy weight for one so young." "Too heavy," Margaret agreed. "I tell him he doesn't need to be the man of the house, but he feels it's his duty. Can't blame him for wanting to protect what's his. What's yours?" Margaret studied Mason's face, noting the lines around his eyes that deepened when he was contemplative. "You understand him." "I was him," Mason said simply. "After my mother died, I thought it was my job to hold everything together, make my father proud. Did you make him proud?" Mason's fingers drummed briefly against his knee. "He never said as much, but the day before he died, he told me I was a better man than he ever was. That was enough." Margaret was touched by the vulnerability in his admission. "And what would that boy you were think of the man you've become?" The question seemed to catch Mason off guard. He was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if she had overstepped. Finally, he met her gaze directly. "He'd wonder why it took me so long to learn that discipline without compassion is just another form of cruelty." The honesty in his voice stirred something in Margaret, a recognition of shared understanding that transcended their differences in approach. "And what would your father think of how you've applied his lessons?" A smile ghosted across Mason's features. "He'd say I've gone soft." "And he might be right." "I don't think so," Margaret countered. "There's strength in gentleness. James understood that. It's what made him a good father." The mention of her late husband hung between them, a reminder of what Margaret had lost and the space Mason was inadvertently beginning to occupy in their lives. She hadn't intended to invite such comparison, and the realization made her cheeks warm. Mason seemed to sense her discomfort. He stood, gazing out over the land that stretched beyond her modest farmhouse. "Your husband built a fine home here. You've done well keeping it going." "I'm trying," Margaret admitted, "but it's harder than I let on. The bank has been patient, but patience has limits." "How bad is it?" Margaret hesitated, unaccustomed to discussing her financial troubles so openly. Yet something about Mason's straightforward manner made it easier to be honest. 3 more months before they might foreclose. "The drought last year hit us hard, and this year's calf crop isn't strong enough to make up the difference." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "What if you focused on quality over quantity? There's a market for breeding stock better prices than sending cattle to slaughter. James mentioned that once, but we never had the capital to invest in better bulls. I know some people, Mason offered, might be able to arrange favorable terms if you're interested. Margaret studied him, searching for motives beyond the assistance he proposed. Why would you help us this way, Mr. Adams? He met her gaze directly. Because Thomas deserves his chance to make this ranch succeed. Because Sarah should climb her trees and Laura should have space to challenge everything. And because you, Mrs. Steele, have created something worth preserving. The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it, that's all. Before Margaret could respond, they were interrupted by the children's return. The moment of intimacy passed, but the offer and all it implied remained. As Mason prepared to leave that evening, the children surprised him with their own gestures of appreciation. Thomas presented him with his first attempt at whittling a rough but recognizable attempt at a horse. Laura had picked wildflowers which she shyly offered in a small bunch. Sarah, not to be outdone, had drawn a picture of Mason on his horse. You've made quite an impression, Margaret observed as they stood by his horse. Mason carefully tucked the gifts into his saddlebag. They're good kids. You've raised them well. With kindness, she reminded him, a gentle teasing in her voice. And clear boundaries, he countered with a smile that transformed his usually stern features. Perhaps we've both learned something. Their eyes met, and Margaret felt a connection that both frightened and exhilarated her. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to see any man as more than a neighbor or a potential threat to her independence. Will you come again? She asked, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. Mason's expression softened. If you'll have me. The children would like that, Margaret said, then added more boldly, as would I. As Mason rode away in the gathering dusk, Margaret stood watching until his silhouette disappeared beyond the ridge. Only then did she acknowledge the flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with neighborly gratitude, and everything to do with the possibility of something she had thought forever closed to her. Over the following weeks, Mason became a regular visitor at the Broken Wheel Ranch. His initial offer of business assistance evolved into a genuine partnership, with Margaret's knowledge of her land complementing Mason's connections in the cattle markets. Together, they developed a plan to transition a portion of her herd toward breeding stock, securing a small loan based on Mason's guarantee rather than the ranch's struggling finances. Thomas thrived under Mason's steady guidance, absorbing lessons in ranching and woodcraft with an eagerness that sometimes brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Laura, initially more reserved with the newcomer, gradually warmed to him when he showed genuine interest in her passionate defense of injured animals and her growing collection of rocks and feathers. Sarah, the most openly affectionate of the three, had claimed Mason as her special friend from the moment he presented her with the carved animals. For Margaret, the transformation was more complex. She found herself anticipating Mason's visits with an intensity that both alarmed and delighted her. Their conversations on the porch after the children were asleep became a cherished ritual discussions of books they had read, experiences that had shaped them, and dreams they still harbored. It was during one such evening in late summer, with crickets providing a gentle chorus and fireflies dotting the darkness, that Mason finally spoke of feelings that had been growing between them. I came to Arizona Territory to start fresh, he said, his voice low and contemplative. Diamond Cross was supposed to be just another job, a place to apply what I knew and move on when the time came. Margaret sat beside him on the porch swing, close enough to feel the warmth of his presence yet maintaining a proper distance. And now I find myself thinking about roots. About staying. He turned to face her, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. About you and the children. Margaret's heart raced, but caution tempered her response. We've grown fond of you, Mason, the children especially. Just the children. He asked, his usual directness softened by uncertainty. Margaret looked out across her land, silver washed in moonlight. When James died, I thought that part of my life was over. I became focused on survival for the children, for the ranch, for his memory. You've done more than survive, Mason said. You've preserved everything that matters. Not everything, Margaret admitted quietly. I've been lonely, Mason. Even surrounded by my children, there's a solitude in bearing all responsibility alone. Mason's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. You don't have to be alone anymore, Margaret. If you'll have me, I want to build something here. With you. Margaret turned to him, searching his face in the dim light. The children need stability. I won't risk their hearts on uncertainty. Nor would I ask you to, Mason assured her. I'm offering permanence, Margaret, a promise. And what of your position at Diamond Cross? Mr. Blackwell has offered to sell me a parcel of his northern section land that borders your property. It could be the start of our own operation, combining your breeding program with additional grazing. Margaret was stunned by the revelation. You've thought this through. Every detail, he confirmed, but none of it matters without you and the children. You've taught me that a ranch is just land without family to give it purpose. The word family hung between them, weighted with possibility. Margaret felt tears gathering, unexpected but not unwelcome. I never thought I'd hear such words again, never thought I'd want to. Mason gently turned her face toward his. I'm not asking you to forget James. He'll always be your children's father and a part of who you are. I'm asking for a place alongside those memories, not in place of them. The understanding in his words broke the last of Margaret's resistance. She leaned forward, bridging the distance between them. Their kiss was gentle at first, tentative with new discovery, then deepening with the acknowledgement of feelings too long contained. When they finally parted, Margaret rested her forehead against Mason's shoulder, her voice barely audible. Yes. His arm tightened around her. Yes. She looked up at him, seeing her future reflected in his eyes. Yes to building something together. Yes to no longer being alone. Yes to showing our children that love can grow even from the hardest ground. Mason's smile in that moment was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, warming and full of promise. They need both, you know, he said softly. Your kindness and my boundaries. Together we give them balance. Together, Margaret echoed, the word no longer frightening but filled with possibility. The wedding took place in October, when the brutal summer heat had yielded to gentler days, and the cottonwoods along the creek had turned to gold. It was a small ceremony in the town church, attended by neighbors and the few friends Margaret had maintained through her year of grieving. Thomas stood tall beside Mason, serving as best man with solemn pride. Laura and Sarah scattered wildflower petals along the aisle. Their dresses sewn from fabric Mason had brought from Tucson as a special surprise. As Margaret and Mason spoke their vows before Reverend Daniels, she felt James's presence not as a shadow, but as a blessing, a chapter of her life that had shaped her into the woman who could now open her heart again. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, which already showed signs of renewal under their combined efforts. New calves dotted the improved pastures, the barn roof had been replaced, and the foundation was laid for an addition to the house, a new bedroom for the girls and a small study, where Thomas could pursue his growing interest in animal husbandry. As evening fell, Mason found Margaret standing alone on the porch, watching their guests depart in wagons and on horseback. He slipped his arm around her waist, and she leaned into his solid presence. "Happy, Mrs. Adams?" he asked, the new name still strange but increasingly right on his lips. "Very," she answered truthfully, "though I keep expecting to wake from a dream." "No dream," Mason assured her, kissing her temple. "Just the result of a stubborn widow and an equally stubborn cowboy finding common ground." Margaret laughed softly. "On the subject of stubborn, have you seen your stepson lately?" They both glanced to where Thomas was earnestly explaining his breeding chart to Mr. Blackwell, who listened with surprising interest to the 10-year-old's theories. "He'll be running this place before he's 20, Mason predicted with pride. "With Laura as his fiercest defender and Sarah charming the buyers," Margaret added. As if hearing her name, Sarah bounded up the porch steps, her energy undiminished despite the long day. "Mama, Papa Mason. Can we have cake now?" The title Papa Mason was Sarah's innovation, adopted after careful consideration and extended family discussions. It acknowledged both the father she had lost and the one she had gained, a bridge between memory and present joy that touched Mason deeply each time he heard it. "Indeed we can, little bird," Mason answered, sweeping her up into his arms. "Let's round up your brother and sister for the occasion." As they moved to rejoin their guests, Margaret felt a sense of completeness she had thought forever lost. The ranch would still face challenges: drought, market fluctuations, the inevitable difficulties of blending lives and expectations. But they would face those challenges together, with the strength that came from combining Mason's structured approach and her nurturing instincts. They had each brought what the other needed, what their family needed: discipline tempered by kindness, kindness strengthened by boundaries, and love the kind that grows not from perfect circumstances, but from the willing hearts of those who choose each other, day after day, through hardship and joy alike. In the years that followed, as their family expanded with the birth of twins Elijah and Emma, the Broken Wheel Ranch became known throughout the territory, not only for its fine breeding stock, but for the family that ran it, a testament to what could grow when loss gave way to new beginnings, and when different approaches found harmony in shared purpose. And on quiet evenings, long after the children were grown with families of their own, Margaret and Mason still sat on that same porch swing, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in colors as vibrant as the life they had built together, a life that had begun with a simple fence line, a spirited disagreement, and the courage to try again.